Craig Tooman joined Silence Therapeutics as CFO in January 2021 and just recently stepped into the CEO's chair there. While it's not his first time in the emerging biopharma CEO seat, he served in that capacity at Avanzar Medical and at animal health-focused Aratana Therapeutics. The bulk of his experience is in biotech finance. He's been a CFO at Aratana, Viome Therapeutics, Icaria, and Enzon Pharmaceuticals. He served as chairman of the audit committee at Insight Vision and Xanodyne Pharmaceuticals. And his earlier experience includes SVP of Strategic Planning at Ilex Oncology, VP of Investor Relations at Pharmacia Corporation, and Director of Strategic Planning at Upjohn. Craig currently sits on the supervisory board at CureVac, and for the past 11 years, he's served as principal at Stockborn, providing strategic business and financial advisory services for companies evaluating fundraising opportunities, product acquisition rights, and strategic partnering ideas. I'm Matt Pillar, and on today's episode of the Business of Biotech, Craig Tooman brings his deep wealth of biotech leadership experience to the conversation. Craig, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
We're honored to have you. And as I said, your background in finance and the business and operations side of pharma and biopharma is intriguing to me. So as we kind of talk through this, I'm interested in your lens on leadership from sort of that financial perspective. So keep that in mind. After being appointed CEO at Silence just recently, after spending a bit more than a year there, I think, in the CFO role, and after the departure of Mark Rothera, why was this a strategic move for Silence to move you into the CEO's role? And I know it's early, by the way. So when this drops, it'll be a few weeks from now. But I think you've been sitting in that chair for what, a few weeks?
That's right. That's right, Matt. Unfortunately, I'll draw, as you've mentioned, on my 30 years in the industry. So I've had a lot of history, and people know me from my financial markets experience. But really, I'll be drawing on, all those roles over the years that I've seen. I've been through finance, marketing, sales, corporate strategy, have done M&A, big companies and small companies, huge companies like Pharmacia, mid-sized companies like Ilex Oncology, but all of them involved in really neat areas of science. And that's really what drives me, is getting in and understanding the science story and finding value where otherwise value hasn't been found. For example, just to give you one example, Ilex Oncology, if you think about it, it's an oncology company that I joined. And ultimately, the drug that we had found utility in multiple sclerosis and solid organ transplant, which had nothing to do with anyone's focus in oncology. And we ended up developing that asset, multiple sclerosis, and ultimately that company was acquired by Genzyme. So again, a huge company has come to find value in something that wasn't apparent to many people at the time. So that's really what drives me in the roles that I've played over the years, is to try and find value where others have not found it.
Yeah, that's interesting, and I want to ask you a quick follow-up question on that. I hope it's not too personal. I want to drill into your psyche a little bit, Craig, because
please,
most I don't know. I hate to paint with a really broad brush. I shouldn't say most. A lot of the finance-oriented. I think you've got like a finance MBA, if I'm not mistaken. I mean, you're kind of a dyed-in-the-wool finance guy, and a lot of people that kind of fit that mold maybe are a bit averse, I should say, to change and dynamic business environments. Your career certainly doesn't look like you've been averse to change or dynamic business environments. The point you just made about Ilex, shifting gears, being creative and creating value where that value perhaps wasn't anticipated. What is it about you? Just curious if you could comment on it. What do you think is it about you that allows you to break out of that sort of rigid, I guess, stereotype of finance people?
Yeah, so I just have a very strong curiosity and a broad range of fields. In fact, been in international operations, spent 4 years in Japan, including a year in college, and then 3 years with Upjohn. So again, it was all pharmaceuticals, but it was learning how pharmaceuticals were treated differently in Japan, for example, which serves me now when we're looking at clinical trials, for example, in Japan. I know quite a bit more about that than many people. So I just have a curiosity in the different aspects of the science, the different aspects of the business, And again, in finding value, you really have no idea what course that could potentially take. It's Silence, such a neat technology, such a hot field right now, but also it's been underappreciated. And even the mRNA field, you mentioned I'm on the supervisory board at CureVac, that field was not as respected as it should have been. And this whole COVID vaccine movement has shifted people's awareness of that technology and what it can do, the flexibility of it and the depth of that flexibility, which, by the way, has been going on for decades. But all of a sudden, because of COVID, it's fast forwarded people's understanding of that technology. So I have a keen interest in the people. People know my investor work and my money raising work. I've raised over $8 billion for the companies I work with, potentially, to grow them and resource them. Mm-hmm. And that's really what drives me, because if you can't resource the projects, then you can't expand and explore the projects. And that's where we are with Silence right now. Very exciting field. This asset we'll talk about, SLN 360, and the other things in the pipeline are just really on the early cusp of being understood, and they need to be resourced. So for me, that comes back to being able to do that on that other side of the equation, which is the finance side.
Yep. All right. Very cool. Very cool. So I want to get into a little bit more on where Silence is at, like right now specifically. For the past few months, we've been kind of muddling through a biotech markets downturn, if you will. And you guys had a CEO change. Obviously, you stepped into that role. And, I've read some press, and I'm too new to the space to be too speculative on this, but I've read some press, some talking heads say, well, anytime that there's a blip on the radar as far as the markets are concerned, or a downturn, we start seeing the shuffling of C-level execs in emerging bio. I guess I'd pose the question to you like this: How is Silence sort of navigating or dealing with managing the downturn that we've seen in the markets over the last few months?
So from a financial standpoint, we're in really good stead. We're a model that actually draws from two sides, partnerships and from our own development pipeline. So because we have large partnerships with great companies like AstraZeneca, we're allowed to develop some of their projects and gain non-dilutive money, so we don't have to go out and raise money for those projects. That's a real unusual part of our business model. As you know, most biotechs are really solely reliant on the equity markets, where we have this hybrid model. The equity markets, as you say, are very challenged. And from a management standpoint, we just have not experienced, a broad management reduction or people leaving for other opportunities. I've read some of those articles about people that do that. I'm really just driven as you can tell from the science and the opportunity in the company, and the notion of a short-term, even a longer-term downturn in the markets is not something that draws me into another opportunity for that reason. So we've been very fortunate. Our turnover is very low. I think people realize we're in a really exciting field, and we actually have the opposite situation where people want to join this field. Yeah. And we're trying to manage our growth. We are growing because we're in a pretty exciting spot right now. So we're kind of in the opposite situation.
Excellent. Yeah, good. When you joined Silence as CFO, what would I say, a year and a half ago or so, what was the initial attraction to making that move to join Silence?
Yeah, so back to undervalued assets. I mean, I saw a company that was really in a neat technology space, but also had some dislocation. So the company was, not well known, not super well known, but had a long history in Europe, and very similar to CureVac when I first joined it. Very little known in the U.S. at the time, believe it or not. Now many people know CureVac. Great company and great technology. So what I wanted to do is try to get to a point where I could help from a IR, PR standpoint, have the company better understood, particularly in the U.S. markets, and then be on the cutting edge of funding these projects and moving them forward to advancement in the clinical trials and ultimately to commercialization. And we'll talk more about a couple of these opportunities, but they have really outstanding opportunities long-term commercializing.
Yeah. Well, go ahead. I'm sorry. No, I'm sorry. You go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, so as you can see, if you look back in the last year, we were dually listed on both NASDAQ and on AIM, so in London. And what we found from that situation is that it was more traded historically in London than in the U.S. And there was a big appeal in biotech from the U.S. investors who wanted to get in. So we've kind of made a little bit of a shift now toward the U.S. to encourage some of those investors and delisted on AIM, which was a big project for me last year. Mm-hmm. And the net effect of that is we've had a lot of interest from U.S. investors, which you would expect. And we press released that when a couple of them have joined. Very, very good, large, long-term investors from the U.S. side.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. So you mentioned that, part of your mission is to sort of affect the perception from an IR and PR standpoint. So let's get into that and learn a little bit about that technology that excites you at Silence. Let's start at the very high level. I mean, you're called Silence Therapeutics, gene silencing. What is your company's approach to gene silencing?
Yeah, what I really like about this, Matt, is that it is, in essence, silencing this chemically, right? The bad portion of this gene that's related to the disease aspects. It is not permanently altering the genome. And so this, to me, is a reversible therapeutic type approach as opposed to a permanent approach. And I think people find that to be a very palatable way for treatment currently.
Mm-hmm. So I'm curious. You mentioned the therapeutic approach. There's a reason we didn't start this conversation off with a very specific sort of diatribe on a very specific indication, because Silence, its pipeline spans a super broad swath of therapeutic areas. I look at your pipeline and I see cardiovascular disease, iron overload disorders, metabolic, autoimmune, respiratory disease. Before I ask you why address so many indications simultaneously, let's talk about how. So can you give us a sort of some insight into how your technology is capable of addressing such a broad swath of indications?
So it really is a platform, right? It is a technology platform, and it is a combination of the chemistry and the linkers, if you will. And I'm going back to my enzyme days with pegylation and the linkers that are actually very, very important, in addition to the chemistry and that approach and the intellectual property you can gain from doing that. But it really is the combination of those that you work with across the platform, in addition to other tools that you have in your toolbox for that differentiation. And that's key in this industry, as you can imagine. And this company has been doing it, as I mentioned, for a long period of time, so understands that whole intellectual property game. But it can look for a company our size that we're very, very broadly based. I think if you look at what we have in our pipeline, it's really for our proprietary projects, it's more cardiovascular and hematologic disorders. That's the areas where we have initially focused for our own projects. But because we have these really great partnerships, in addition to those, right, they come in to us and say, we would like to explore in the areas that we're also interested in. And we're aware that your technology has a greater probability of success. In other words, compared to pharma, our rates of success are quite a bit higher for moving from phase 1 to phase 2 and phase 2 to phase 3. So across the industry. So the whole idea is this gold platform, GalNAc liver-oriented orientation is really interesting for big parties and ourselves. So that has taken us into a little broader development scheme, if you will, than probably normally we would have done ourselves. But it's very exciting for us because we get to explore and understand how we can achieve these targets in other areas.
Yeah. Yeah. Having the technology to tackle a broad swath of indications is one thing, but then managing a company's ability to, for lack of a better word, manage all those indications and those partnerships that introduce new indications. That's a different story. So give us a little bit on that. Like what is your organizational structure? How does your organizational structure facilitate attention, and focus on so many different projects?
No, you're right. And look, as we advance in the clinic and those phases get larger and more expensive, we grow. And there's no question about that. We're in that phase where we're growing people and program management and working through the clinicals, in addition to interfacing with our great partners. So early on, when you're in the very early stages, the resource requirement is certainly lesser. As you grow, and we're in this phase now that as we see real excitement in the clinical outcomes, we need to actually grow into that. So that is that phase that we're in that needs to be resourced. And again, that's a really interesting situation for us because we have that combination of external reliance on markets and less reliance because we have partnerships with good parties.
Yeah.
We have Hansoh. You've probably seen that Hansoh deal in China. We've got Mallinckrodt and we've got AstraZeneca. And I can tell you other companies are approaching us with a lot of interest in this field right now.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that is compensated, if you will, right? As you advance, it's compensated and then handed off to those other parties in the later stages of development, such that the real heavy expense portion is not always borne by us.
When you're striving to excel in a new arena, the best guides are the ones already doing it well. The Business of Biotech brings those voices forward to help new and emerging biopharmas turn their innovations, like mRNA and cell and gene therapies, into clinical realities. Tune in and subscribe for insights on hiring, regulatory, and other need-to-know topics for biopharma leaders. The podcast is brought to you in collaboration with Cytiva. Check out their resources at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. That's CYTIVA.com/emerging biotech. So you've sort of divested some of the financial requirements to keep moving forward.
It's shared and then shifted as it gets more expensive. So it's a really neat little model to help explore together, if you will.
Is that a model that you think is novel, or is it something that perhaps did you influence that approach based on all your myriad experiences prior to Silence?
The model does exist for companies, but I have to tell you, it's pretty unique. It's a pretty unique model, and other companies all are challenged with making that decision of, do you do more in the proprietary sense or do you do more in the partnering sense? Mm-hmm. And in the period we're in, we're down the middle of essentially a 50-50 orientation. And certainly companies, even in our sector, have picked to do more partnering or to do more on their own. And there are pluses and minuses to both of those, as you can imagine. But we like very much where we are right now because we've got some really neat programs that are our own. And for a company our size to have programs like that are wholly owned are really exciting. And then from the value proposition, it's always interesting to have others and allow you to explore.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. What would you consider the most challenging aspect of leading a company that operates under this model? Is it decision making? I mean, it occurs to me, like as I'm thinking about it, like you've got potential candidates, you've got technologies that address those candidates. You're making decisions about what to maintain as proprietary, what's fair game for partnership, financial decisions around what offers might look like for partnerships for those candidates. I would imagine that a lot of it comes down to decision making and perhaps the way that your decisions and your board's decisions affect the rest of the company. I don't want to put.
Oh, you're right. You're absolutely right. We are so much in vogue right now, to be honest, that we have more opportunities than we can pursue. There's no question about that. So the question really is, where can you provide the most value? And you would expect that's where I spend my time trying to figure out where to put that incremental dollar to get incremental return for our owners. And that's a great problem to have, particularly right now as we're getting inundated with requests for different trials, different studies, different targets.
Yep. Okay. Tell us about your internal clinical progress. Where are you in terms of the proprietary candidates that you're pursuing?
Thank you for asking. I probably have been as enthused as any program I've seen in my 30 years of pharmaceutical history with SLN 360, which is a cardiovascular Lp(a) use. And this is a genetic disorder, and it is potentially a very large indication over a period of time. We're just in phase 1. We just announced phase 1 data, which in my history I've not seen, up to, at the highest dose, 98% knockdown in Lp(a). So this is 98%. I challenge people to find something that works that well in any indication. And this is a sub-Q. and is long lasting, is durable for essentially 5 months in the trial that we've seen so far. Again, it's phase 1, it's early, but I've never seen anything that shows efficacy in the 98% range in the initial studies. It's just profound.
Yeah, yeah, for
and
sure.
Remember, this is a genetic issue, so it's not something that you can influence. For example, in lipids with diet and exercise, the statins, you can actually influence that through lifestyle.
Right.
Here, you really can't. You're born with this situation, so to have that sort of knockdown is pretty incredible.
Yeah, it is. What's the next step with that trial?
So actually, the full data set for that is scheduled to be released this weekend at ACC, a huge cardiovascular conference by a world-renowned leader in the field from Cleveland Clinic, Dr. Steve Nissen. So that actually, the full data set will be out. And then we'll be moving that into a phase 2 trial this year to look at that next phase of development. But we're very encouraged by what we see in this, early results from this study.
Yeah. So, you mentioned it's a genetic condition. Is there a well-defined patient population for that indication?
Yeah, it's not that well known, but certainly well-defined. So again, it's probably potentially that market could be as large as the stat market over any period of time. And I know a lot of people have talked about that. You have large companies dedicated to this field. Mm-hmm. So we just feel really good about our technology being really cutting edge and those early results that we have out of that.
Yeah. Can you give us sort of an illustration of the manufacturing approach at Silence for that particular therapy?
Yeah, so manufacturing is one of those areas that you do have to get right. It's very complex. And we don't have our own manufacturing facilities, but over a period of time, what you do is you build out those aspects of the manufacturing that you need. So in the shorter period of time, again, we're in the earlier window right now. You really handle that through suppliers that you work closely with and have over a period of years. Yeah. Longer term, as you're successful and you need to scale up, and this is back to the resourcing and scale up I talked about, then you look to do some of that yourself, at least a portion of it.
What kind of volume, given what you know about the indication now and the patient population, what kind of volume do you anticipate moving into necessary moving into clinical?
Look, we're excited. We certainly are planning for that sort of situation when we see these large markets and what's possible. The likelihood is, again, back to this model that we have, is that when you move into a period that is large scale commercial and large scale development in the later stages, and we've been very public with this, we'll look to partner also with somebody who's a large partner who knows these fields commercially, and then kind of back into the volumes that you would require. So, there are some great companies in here, large companies like Amgen, who will be there as a competitor potentially. So you need to really move into a partnership arena over a period of time to compete with those kind of companies.
Yeah. Okay.
But right now we're focused really on the technology and moving it into phase 2.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. We've had just in the last, 6 months, we've produced a few events on a few bioprocess online events on mRNA. And we've had several guest contributors and columns on the website, writing about the market and the technology and the clinical landscape for mRNA in particular. But RNA anything, is getting all sorts of attention right now. The stuff that we're putting out on this is like it's crushing our engagement metric records. That's thanks in no small part to the fact that it's a public term, right? Like it's thanks to the COVID vaccine, it's household conversation. But I'm curious about, at a deeper level than that, what it looks like for a company like Silence. You've got this mRNAi gold platform. What is the hype level, the attention that the mRNA world is getting right now? How does that kind of work out for Silence, given that you've got this platform and the technology?
Well, the really great thing is we have history in it, spanning back a long period of time. So again, it's relatively known recently, right? And it's the same for the mRNA companies, the COVID companies. If you look back at their market cap 3-4 years ago, it's a very different situation than what you see today. You look at Moderna, that long ago, right? It's a very different situation. But the technology, I think, is here to stay, and it's known, of course, for COVID. It's now shifting to the peripheral beyond mRNA in the fields that typically know in COVID. And so they're looking at siRNA, some of our fields, and some of those genetic things. I think you'll also see utility in oncology, for example, right? So people are going back to the roots of where they initially were exploring some of these technologies. And it really isn't a COVID-focused, disease treatment. So I'm really excited about, the fields that we're in and how we differentiate in the fields that we're in. And it is so fast moving that, part of our challenge is just to stay, paced and ahead for the areas that we want to be in.
Yeah. A
lot of attention, a lot of resources in this field right now.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. How do you address that challenge? That challenge of staying on pace. Is it an IP thing? Is it a people thing? Is it a more time in the lab thing? What
you've nailed the two big ones, IP and people. I mean, we have really great scientists. We have for many years cutting edge people doing cutting edge science, and the same with intellectual property. It really is key. But again, I think that hybrid model that we've talked about allows us to explore more broadly than typically we could for a company our size by the resourcing assistance of some of those other big parties that we're partners with.
Right. Yeah. Very exciting. What else? What haven't I asked you, Craig, that you think is germane or relevant to the story at Silence right now? What have I done a poor job of interviewing you on?
No, I think you've asked all the right questions. It's going to be really exciting for this company as we are emerging from a company that's had a long history, but it's going to become better known and is becoming better known. I've actually heard that from third parties that versus even a year or two ago, we're much better known. And we're really committed to that. People understanding our story. The investors are clearly getting it. You have some top tier people already that have come in publicly and taken stakes in the company. And it's the same with partners. I mean, for a company like us to have partnerships like AstraZeneca and others, I think is telling because, those partnerships are very, very important to us and very important to them as they're seeking kind of the new technologies.
Yeah.
So I think it's just a really exciting time for us, and this SLN 360 wholly owned program that has really outsized potential could be very, very intriguing.
Yeah. I'd concur. I didn't know really much, if anything, about Silence coming into this conversation beyond, to your point, when I joined the space a couple of years ago. I think I had seen some press from the UK about this company Silence. It was intriguing. I think at the time, to your point, you were known there, but it was sort of like, there wasn't a whole lot known over here about what you guys were doing. And just recently, you hit the radar, and I hope that, we're able to kind of help you maintain your position on that radar here in the States.
Yeah, I think this next chapter will be anything but silent.
Yeah. Very well done. Very well done. Excellent. What's the next big project on your plate specifically?
Well, as I mentioned, this SLN 360 data being shared at ACC, I think is really going to be capturing people's attention in a way that companies our size probably never see. I mean, and to be a late breaking session by such a well-known individual at such a huge conference, on phase 1 data, that is very atypical when you do the stats. Yep. And it's because the outcome in our phase 1 was profound. As I mentioned, 98% at the highest dose. Personally, I've not seen in my 30 years.
Yeah, that's incredible. Remind us when and where that conference is taking place.
That will be Sunday morning at ACC, and I'm sure we'll have information on our website so people will be able to see. The conferences tend to be embargoed, but that'll be Sunday morning, first thing, 8 o'clock or so on, this Sunday.
Awesome. This Sunday. Cool. Well, thank you for joining us, Craig. I appreciate it. It's been a pleasure to have you and to learn a little bit more about Silence. And, on that exciting news from your phase 1 clinicals, we'll be paying attention and following along on the journey.
Thank you very much for the time. Look forward to following up.
My pleasure.
Okay.
So that's Silence Therapeutics CEO Craig Tooman. I'm Matt Pillar, and this is the Business of Biotech. We're produced by Bioprocess Online, and I encourage you to visit us at bioprocessonline.com, where you'll find volumes of resources for biopharma professionals and where you can sign up for my newsletter. We're sponsored by Cytiva, which also demonstrates its commitment to new and emerging biopharmas at its biotech accelerator at cytiva.com/emerging biotech. Bookmark those 2 sites. If you're enjoying the pod, please give us a rating and tell your colleagues about it. In the meantime, thanks for listening.